In 1962, the United States Army sends 5 unarmed helicopters and their crews to South Vietnam. Their mission is to evacuate wounded soldiers from the battlefield. Their call sign is DUSTOFF. Over the next 11 years, those 5 helicopters will become hundreds. The crews will evacuate nearly 900,000 casualties, and the died-off wounds rate for American servicemen will drop to the lowest in the history of warfare. The men who fly these missions will also die at 3 to 4 times the rate of any other aviation unit in the theater. They fly without weapons, into active fire, because someone on the ground is bleeding. It is, by any measure, one of the most dangerous jobs in Vietnam.
This is Rebel 6, request DUSTOFF. DUSTOFF, over.
The concept behind DUSTOFF is older than the war itself. During the Korean War, the Army began using small helicopters to move wounded soldiers from the front lines to surgical hospitals, and the results were striking. Men who would have died waiting for a ground ambulance survived because a helicopter got them to a surgeon within the first hour after injury, the so-called golden hour. Getting a casualty onto a surgeon's table within 60 minutes of being wounded could mean the difference between life and death, and helicopters were the only technology that could compress the battlefield's distances into that window. The aircraft used in Korea were primitive by later standards. The Bell 47, the bubble-canopied helicopter familiar from the television series MASH, carried 2 patients on external litter racks, exposed to the elements, and had a range measured in tens of miles. It proved the principle. It could not meet the scale of what was coming. What Korea established was a medical concept. What Vietnam would require was an entirely different level of execution. By the early 1960s, the Army has a new helicopter. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, universally known as the Huey, is a turbine-powered machine that transforms what helicopter evacuation can mean. It is fast, with a cruising speed above 100 knots. It can carry multiple litter patients internally, protected from weather and debris. It has the range and payload to operate across the distances that Vietnam's geography demands, from the Mekong Delta to the Central Highlands. And it arrives in Southeast Asia at the precise moment the American advisory mission begins expanding into something much larger. The Huey will become the defining vehicle of the Vietnam War. For DUSTOFF, it makes the entire program possible. The formal beginning comes in 1962, when the 57th Medical Detachment Helicopter Ambulance deploys to Tan Son Nhut Air Base near Saigon. The unit is small, 5 Hueys, their crews, and a commanding officer named Major Lloyd Spencer. Its mission is to provide air and medical evacuation support to South Vietnamese forces and the growing number of American advisors operating in the field. From the outset, the unit operates under Geneva Convention provisions for medical vehicles. The helicopters carry prominent Red Cross markings on a white background and no offensive armament of any kind. This is a deliberate decision grounded in international law, and it carries significant operational consequences. DUSTOFF aircraft depend entirely on escort gunships or suppressive fire from ground forces for protection when flying into hostile landing zones. When neither is available, which is frequently the case during the advisory period and often thereafter, the crews go in anyway. The call sign itself has a somewhat disputed origin. The unit's original radio designation is simply medical, which causes confusion on crowded radio nets since it could refer to any medical asset in the area. The 57th adopts DUSTOFF as a distinctive identifier, and it sticks. Some accounts later attribute the word to an acronym dedicated unhesitating service to our fighting forces, though this appears to be a backronym applied after the call sign is already in common use. The etymology matters less than what the word comes to mean. Within months, every American soldier in Vietnam knows that DUSTOFF means a helicopter is coming for you if you are hit. That understanding becomes one of the most powerful morale factors of the entire war. The man who does more than anyone to define what DUSTOFF will become is Major Charles Kelly, who takes command of the 57th Medical Detachment in early 1964. Kelly is an aggressive, operationally minded officer who believes the evacuation mission's value is measured in response time and that any delay costs lives. He pushes his crews to respond immediately to every call, regardless of weather, darkness, or the tactical situation on the ground. He establishes the principle that a dust-off aircraft will never refuse a mission because conditions are too dangerous. That principle will become the operational ethos of every dust-off unit that follows. It will also kill him. On July 1st, 1964, Kelly is shot down and killed while attempting to evacuate South Vietnamese casualties near Vinh Long in the Mekong Delta. His helicopter takes fire on the initial approach, and his crew chief urges him to pull off and wait for gunship escort. Kelly's response, transmitted over the radio, becomes the unofficial motto of DUSTOFF: "When I have your wounded." He goes back in. He does not come out. Kelly's death sets the standard for everything that follows. The mission now carries a moral weight that overrides normal tactical calculations. A transport pilot can abort an insertion if the landing zone is too hot. A gunship crew can break off an attack run if fire is too heavy. A dust-off crew cannot decline a pickup because someone on the ground is bleeding. This asymmetry between the danger and the rules will shape every dimension of how dust-off operates for the rest of the war, from crew selection to aircraft configuration to the psychological burden carried by the men who fly these missions day after day. It also creates a particular kind of aviator. When the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile deploys to the Central Highlands and fights the battles of the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965, the demand for casualty evacuation exceeds anything the existing medical detachments can handle. The 1st Cav is by design the most helicopter-dependent division in the Army, and its operations in the Ia Drang marked the first time American troops engaged North Vietnamese regulars in sustained, large-scale combat. The fighting produces hundreds of American casualties in a matter of days across multiple landing zones, several of which are under continuous fire for hours at a stretch. Dust-off crews fly repeated missions into Landing Zone X-Ray and Landing Zone Albany under conditions that test the limits of what unarmed helicopters can survive. At X-Ray, evacuation aircraft approach through a single corridor between trees while North Vietnamese forces fire from positions within a few hundred meters of the perimeter. At Albany, the ambush that strikes 2-7 Cavalry on November 17th is so close quarters and so chaotic that finding a safe landing point for dust-off aircraft is nearly impossible for much of the engagement. The lessons are immediate and practical. Response times need to be faster. More aircraft need to be assigned to the medical mission. Coordination between dust-off crews, ground units, and supporting gunships needs to be formalized into a system that can scale with the war. And the Army needs to recognize that the airmobile concept it has invested so heavily in will generate airmobile casualties at a rate that requires a corresponding investment in airmobile evacuation. This recognition comes slowly. It is a pattern that will recur throughout the conflict. By 1966, the dust-off force has expanded significantly, with medical detachments assigned across all 4 core tactical zones. Each detachment typically operates 5 Hueys, positioned at bases that allow coverage of their assigned area of operations. The standard is 24-hour availability. Crews sleep beside their aircraft, ready to launch within minutes of receiving a call. The dispatch system works through a standardized chain. A wounded soldiers unit transmits a 9-line Medevac request on a dedicated frequency. The format is rigid precisely because clarity under fire is not something that can be left to improvisation. It specifies the pickup location, radio frequency, number of patients by precedence category, special equipment needed, number of litter versus ambulatory patients, security of the landing zone, method of marking the pickup site, patient nationality and status, and any nuclear, biological, or chemical contamination hazard. A radio man on the ground, who may himself be under fire, transmits this information in a format that a crew miles away can act on immediately. The request passes through a medical operations center that prioritizes and routes the mission based on the urgency category. Urgent means the patient will die or lose a limb without evacuation within the hour. Priority means a serious wound requiring prompt but not immediate evacuation. Routine means the patient is stable enough to wait. The system then assigns the nearest available dust-off crew who lift off into whatever is waiting for them. On a busy day in a hot area of operations, a single crew might fly 10 or 15 missions. On a quiet day, none. The unpredictability is its own kind of burden. The operational realities of a dust-off mission vary enormously by terrain and region. In the relatively flat Mekong Delta, 3rd and 4th Corps, landing zones are often open rice paddies. The helicopter is exposed, but at least the crew can see what is around them. In the Central Highlands or the mountainous terrain of 1st Corps, near the DMZ, landing zones are small clearings cut from jungle canopy, ringed by trees that funnel the approach into a narrow corridor where the aircraft is most vulnerable. Altitude compounds the problem. A Huey at 3,000 feet of elevation in the Central Highlands loses significant lift capacity, which means longer, slower approaches and reduced ability to climb out quickly if things go wrong. Weather is an equally serious adversary. Vietnam's monsoon seasons can reduce visibility to near zero and ground every other aircraft in the theater. Dust-off crews fly in conditions that keep transport and assault helicopters on the ground because the calls keep coming regardless of the weather. Instrument flying in mountainous terrain at low altitude in a single-engine helicopter with no terrain avoidance radar is extraordinarily dangerous. A significant number of dust-off losses are attributed to weather-related accidents rather than enemy fire, though the distinction is sometimes academic. A crew that crashes into a ridge while flying through clouds to reach a wounded man is just as dead as one shot down over a hot landing zone. Night operations add another layer of difficulty. The Huey is not designed for nighttime low-level flight in hostile terrain, and the night vision technology available for most of the war is primitive by later standards. Early dust-off night missions rely on landing zone illumination provided by ground troops using flashlights, vehicle headlights, or improvised signal fires, any of which can also serve as an aiming point for enemy gunners. Flare ships from supporting aviation units can light up an area, but flare illumination casts moving shadows that distort depth perception and make approaches unpredictable. Later in the war, some dust-off crews gain access to early-generation starlight scopes that amplify ambient light, though these offer resolution adequate for spotting a clearing but not for judging the obstacles within it. Despite these limitations, dust-off flies at night because casualties do not stop bleeding when the sun goes down. The standing expectation is 24-hour availability, and crews who cannot manage a night approach in marginal conditions do not last long in the assignment. The question of armament is a persistent source of tension throughout the war. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical vehicles displaying the Red Cross emblem are to be respected and protected by all parties to a conflict. In exchange, those vehicles carry no offensive weapons. The theory is that the markings will deter attack. The practice in Vietnam bears little resemblance to the theory. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces routinely fire on marked medical helicopters, and in many cases appear to target them deliberately, understanding that destroying an evacuation aircraft has an outside psychological effect on the troops below. Dust-off crews report that the Red Cross markings sometimes seem to attract fire rather than deflect it. Some crews begin carrying personal sidearms. A few aircraft are fitted with M60 machine guns by unauthorized field modification, violating the conventions the entire program is built on. The Army's formal position remains that dust-off aircraft will fly unarmed, and most crews comply. They adapt instead through technique: high-speed, low-level approaches into the landing zone, sharp decelerations, minimal time on the ground, and immediate departure at maximum power. Survival is a function of pilot skill and speed, not armor or firepower. A standard dust-off crew consists of 4 men: the aircraft commander, the pilot, the crew chief, and the medical corpsman, often called the medic. The aircraft commander and pilot fly the ship. The crew chief maintains the helicopter, mans whatever observation position is available, watches for threats, and helps load patients. The medic's job begins the moment the first casualty comes aboard. Working in a cramped, vibrating cabin that may be taking fire, the medic assesses injuries, applies tourniquets, starts intravenous fluids, manages airways, and makes the rapid triage decisions that determine whether a man lives or dies in the minutes between pickup and hospital. Many dust-off medics are trained to a level well beyond what their rank would suggest, performing procedures in flight that would normally require a physician's supervision on the ground. The relationship between the flight crew and the medic is central to how dust-off functions. The pilots make the tactical decisions, getting to the landing zone and getting out. The medic makes the medical decisions, prioritizing casualties and directing the loading sequence. In a mass casualty situation, when the helicopter cannot carry everyone at once, the medic determines who goes first. A man with a survivable wound may wait for the next ship, while a man with a more critical injury goes now. The psychological weight of that calculus, repeated across hundreds of missions, is difficult to overstate. The overall statistics of DUSTOFF operations are remarkable by any measure. Between 1962 and 1973, DUSTOFF units evacuate an estimated 900,000 patients. Roughly two-thirds are Vietnamese military personnel or civilians rather than Americans. The average response time from a unit's request for evacuation to the arrival of a DUSTOFF aircraft on the ground is approximately 35 minutes, a figure that would be impressive for a civilian ambulance service and is extraordinary in a combat zone. During the peak years of 1968 and 1969, DUSTOFF crews average over 100,000 evacuations annually across all core zones. The died-of wounds rate for American servicemen who reach a medical facility alive is 2.6%. In World War II, that figure was roughly 4.5%. In Korea, around 2.5%. Vietnam improves on even the Korean standard, and the improvement is almost entirely attributable to the speed of helicopter evacuation. Still, the figures do not tell the whole story. The cost of maintaining that system falls disproportionately on the crews themselves. DUSTOFF units suffer a casualty rate 3 to 4 times higher than other Army aviation units in Vietnam. Over the course of the war, the 54th Medical Detachment alone loses more aircraft commanders killed in action than any single assault helicopter company. The names accumulate. Major Charles Kelly in 1964, Captain Thomas Grabo killed near Quang Tri in 1969, Warrant Officer Michael Blassie, whose remains are later controversially interred in the tomb of the unknown soldier before being identified through DNA testing in 1998. Major Patrick Brady, who survives and receives the Medal of Honor, is one of the fortunate ones. Each name represents a crew that flew into a situation where the odds were explicitly against them because someone on the ground needed them. The Tet Offensive in early 1968 pushes DUSTOFF to its operational limits. When North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched simultaneous attacks across South Vietnam on January 30th, the demand for casualty evacuation spikes beyond anything the system has previously handled. In Saigon, in Hue, in the provincial capitals of the Mekong Delta, DUSTOFF crews fly continuous missions for days, often shuttling between multiple pickup points before returning to offload patients at overwhelmed field hospitals. Major Patrick Brady, then commanding a DUSTOFF platoon in the area around Chu Lai, flies 3 separate missions on January 6, 1968. He evacuates over 50 casualties while operating in fog so thick that his crew navigates by following roads and rivers visible below the canopy. On one approach, his aircraft is so heavily damaged by ground fire that he switches to a backup helicopter and continues flying. Brady's Medal of Honor citation describes actions that are, by DUSTOFF standards, extraordinary in degree, but not in kind. What he does that day, flying unarmed into hostile fire to retrieve wounded soldiers, is what every DUSTOFF crew is expected to do on any given day of the war. The operational tempo of 1968 and 1969 exposes structural problems that have been building for years. DUSTOFF units are chronically short of both aircraft and crews relative to the demand. The maintenance burden on helicopters flying that many hours in tropical conditions is immense, and replacement aircraft are slow to arrive through the supply pipeline. Pilot turnover is constant, with aviators rotating out after their 12-month tour and taking hard-won tactical knowledge with them. The medical detachments, small by design, have little organizational depth to absorb losses or sustain high-tempo operations over extended periods. A detachment that loses 1 aircraft and crew drops from 5 operational ships to 4, a 20% reduction in capacity with no quick replacement available. The system runs on thin margins, and those margins get thinner under pressure. The relationship between DUSTOFF and the ground forces they support is shaped by persistent tension. Infantry commanders want medical evacuation immediately, regardless of the tactical situation on the ground. Dust-off crews are willing to take extraordinary risks, but they are the only ones who can assess the feasibility of a specific approach to a specific landing zone at a specific moment. Disagreements over whether a landing zone is survivable occasionally produce serious friction between ground commanders and aviation officers, particularly when a dust-off crew judges that an approach is not possible and the ground commander, listening to his wounded soldiers, insists they try. The standing policy, reinforced by Charles Kelly's legacy, heavily favors attempting the mission. But experienced crews understand a distinction that outsiders sometimes miss. The obligation is to reach the wounded. A crew shot down on approach evacuates no one. The best dust-off pilots find ways into landing zones where others cannot, but they do so through skill and calculated judgment, not through blind compliance with demands from the ground. The difference is subtle, but it matters. After 1969, Vietnamization gradually shifts the ground combat burden to South Vietnamese forces, but dust-off operations do not diminish proportionally. American medical evacuation crews continue to fly missions in support of AVAN operations, and the Vietnamese Air Force's own evacuation capability remains limited throughout the war. Efforts to train South Vietnamese helicopter crews in the dust-off mission produce mixed results. The South Vietnamese have capable pilots, but the institutional culture that sustains dust-off, the willingness to fly unarmed into hostile fire as a matter of routine organizational expectation, proves difficult to transplant. It requires a support infrastructure, a maintenance pipeline, a dispatch system, and a depth of trained medical personnel that the South Vietnamese military struggles to replicate while simultaneously fighting a war. The 1972 Easter Offensive, when North Vietnamese forces launch a conventional invasion across the DMZ and into the Central Highlands, generates massive casualty evacuation demands that fall heavily on the remaining American dust-off units, even as most American ground forces have already withdrawn. The offensive produces casualty numbers that more closely resemble conventional warfare than the guerrilla engagements of earlier years, with AVAN units taking heavy losses in sustained fighting around An Loc, Con Tom, and along the approaches to Huey. American dust-off crews find themselves supporting a war the United States is ostensibly leaving, flying missions at a tempo that would have strained the force even at its peak strength. Dust-off's institutional legacy extends well beyond Vietnam. The air medical evacuation doctrine developed in Southeast Asia becomes the foundation for how the United States Army approaches casualty evacuation in every subsequent conflict. The Golden Hour principle, which dust-off operations validate with statistical evidence across nearly 1 million evacuations, is formally adopted as a planning standard. The tiered medical system that dust-off feeds into, from point of injury through battalion aid station to field hospital and evacuation hospital, becomes the template for combat medical architecture. The procedures that dust-off corpsmen develop in the back of Hueys, techniques for managing trauma patients in flight, controlling hemorrhage with limited supplies and no stable surface, maintaining airways in patients who cannot be intubated under normal conditions, inform the development of modern tactical combat casualty care protocols. The data generated by dust-off operations, hundreds of thousands of cases documenting the relationship between evacuation time and survival outcomes, gives military medicine an empirical foundation it has never previously possessed. When American forces operate in Iraq and Afghanistan decades later, the evacuation architecture they rely on is recognizably descended from what dust-off builds in Vietnam, down to the dedicated Medevac call signs and the unarmed helicopter doctrine which persists, controversially, into the 21st century. The human dimension of the dust-off mission illuminates something about how the war is experienced that the larger strategic narrative often obscures. A dust-off crew's war is not measured by territory gained or enemy killed. There is no hill to take, no hamlet to secure, no body count to report. The metric is the wounded man on the ground, and the mission resets every time the radio carries a new 9-line evacuation request. A crew might fly a dozen missions in a day and save a dozen lives without appearing in any operational summary. The work is invisible in the terms that the war's official metrics use to measure progress, which may explain why dust-off units remain under-resourced for most of the conflict. They do not produce the statistics that commanders brief to Washington. The invisibility has consequences. Dust-off crews receive fewer decorations proportional to their exposure than almost any other aviation specialty in Vietnam. The bureaucratic machinery of awards and recognition is oriented toward offensive operations, and medical evacuation, defensive and reactive by nature, does not fit comfortably into the existing framework. When Patrick Brady receives his Medal of Honor, it is notable partly because dust-off missions have historically been overlooked by the awards system. Michael Novosul is a case that captures something essential about the dust-off mission. A remarkable figure who flew combat missions in World War II, Novosul returns to active duty as a warrant officer specifically to fly dust-off in Vietnam. He receives his Medal of Honor for a 1969 mission near the Cambodian border in which he evacuates 29 wounded South Vietnamese soldiers under intense fire, making repeated passes into a landing zone that is actively contested. Novosul is 47 years old at the time, flying missions alongside pilots half his age. His story illustrates the particular type of person drawn to this work. The toll on those who survive is significant and often delayed. Dust-off crews accumulate a psychological burden that differs from other forms of combat aviation. They do not merely witness the aftermath of battle, they handle it. They load wounded men into their aircraft, fly with the dying, and deliver them to field hospitals where some of them do not make it. They do this repeatedly, across hundreds of missions, in an environment where the next call can come before they have processed the last one. Post-war studies find elevated rates of post-traumatic stress among dust-off veterans, though many of the men who flew these missions reject that framing. The work, they insist, had a clarity of purpose that other parts of the war lacked. They knew exactly why they were there and what they were doing. Whether that certainty is a genuine comfort or a coping mechanism is a question without a clean answer. By the time the last American dust-off aircraft departs Vietnam, the program has demonstrated something the broader war effort cannot claim: unambiguous, measurable success in its stated mission. The evacuation system works, response times are fast, survival rates are high, and the knowledge that a helicopter will come for you, regardless of circumstances, has an effect on American combat morale that is difficult to quantify but universally acknowledged by the soldiers who depend on it. A wounded infantryman in the jungle of War Zone C or on the ridgelines near Khe Sanh does not need to understand MACV's strategic assessments, the progress of Vietnamization, or the state of the Paris peace negotiations. He needs to know that if he is hit, someone is coming. Dust-off makes that promise. And across nearly 900,000 evacuations over 11 years, at a cost borne quietly by a small force of crews whose exposure far exceeded the recognition they received, Dust-off keeps it.